two, one.
In July, when Cornwallis's army had moved to the east and was camped in the small city of Portsmouth near Chesapeake Bay, James Armistead reported that a fleet of sailing ships had come to anchor in the harbor, ready to carry British troops to a new post. Lafayette expected news that Cornwallis had sailed, but for weeks there was no change. The ships lay idle at an anchor day after day, and enemy troops remained in their camp at Portsmouth. At last, in early August, there was a warning from James Armistead. Cornwallis had sailed, no one knew where. The army of redcoats had disappeared from Portsmouth. Wonder where they went. Within a few days, Lafayette scouts learned the enemy's secret. Cornwallis was unloading his troops at Yorktown, a small tobacco port on the York River, within sight of the broad Chesapeake. Lafayette and his Americans moved nearer to Williamsburg, where they could keep watch. They saw that Cornwallis was in no hurry to build defenses about the village. The weather was hot, and only a few men worked at digging trenches. Lafayette reported the news to Washington, who was still in the north. So they got there, those British guys, and they didn't do anything to protect themselves. That sounds kind of good. Sometimes during these days, James Armistead returned to Lafayette's camp and no doubt told the French officer that he had been sent there by Cornwallis himself as a spy for the British. There was soon exciting word from headquarters. General Washington wrote Lafayette that news of very great importance was on the way. The commander urged the Frenchmen to hold Cornwallis in Yorktown and to prevent his army from escaping. Lafayette guessed the truth. Washington and the French commander in America, Count Rochambeau, were marching south with their troops, and at the same time French fleets were sailing for the Chesapeake. Cornwallis was to be cut off by land and sea. Meanwhile, only Lafayette's small army could hold Cornwallis in place. So let's see what happens. There's James Armistead still listening in on all the plans. Lafayette reported to Washington, "I hope you will find we have taken the best precaution to lessen his lordship's chances to escape." By early September, the trap was closing on Cornwallis. A French fleet defeated British warships at sea just outside the Chesapeake, drove them back to their port in New York, and anchored in the bay. By the middle of the month, Washington and Rochambeau and the first of their soldiers reached Williamsburg, where Lafayette welcomed them. 2 weeks later, the American and French armies, led by Lafayette's small force, marched a few miles to Yorktown and surrounded the village. The Allied soldiers dug trenches ever closer to the enemy. Huge French cannons were hauled into place and began firing in early October. By October 19th, after only 10 days of shelling, Cornwallis surrendered. His army marched out from the battered lines of Yorktown and laid down its arms, meaning their guns, the arms. The battles of the Revolution were over. The broken-hearted Cornwallis himself did not ride out with his troops on the day of surrender, but remained in his headquarters in a cave outside the York River. It was only 2 days later, when he had recovered, that Cornwallis left the village. In defeat, he went to the headquarters of young Lafayette. The two generals were talking of the campaign, looking over the maps, when Cornwallis looked up to see the familiar face of James Armistead. The black spy wore an American uniform. The British general shook his head grimly, for it was only then that he realized that the volunteer who had served him so faithfully was in truth an American counter-spy. The cunning and devotion of this young slave had played an important part in winning the final battle of the war. Now, did he earn his freedom? There he sees Cornwallis, and now let's go back and see what happened to Armistead. 1 year after a treaty of peace had ended the war, Lafayette wrote a certificate praising the work of James Armistead as a spy. This is to certify that the bearer by the name of James has done essential services to me while I had the honor to command in this state. His intelligences from the enemy's camp were industriously collected and more faithfully delivered. In other words, they collected everything he said and they delivered it faithfully, and he did extremely important work, the essential work there. He properly acquitted himself with some important commissions I gave him. So acquitted means kind of almost like set himself innocent, and appears to me entitled to every reward his situation can admit of. Done under my hand, Richmond, November 21st, 1784. Lafayette. So, soon afterward, James Armistead sent this certificate to the General Assembly of Virginia and asked that he be declared a free man. In his petition, he said that he had volunteered to help against the British. During the time of his serving the Marquis Lafayette, he was often at peril of his life, and he found means to frequent the British camp, by which means he kept open a channel of the most useful communications to the army of the state. So in other words, by putting himself at risk, he was able to get the information back to Lafayette that Lafayette needed. And that information was of the most secret and important kind, the possession of which, if discovered on him, would have most certainly endangered the life of your petitioner. In other words, if someone had discovered what he was doing, he surely would have died. Even now, Armistead said he would not demand his freedom unless his master, William Armistead, could be paid a reasonable price for the loss of so valuable a workman. So he would stay and be a slave if no one would pay for him to be freed. The Virginia General Assembly agreed. The state paid Armistead a fair price, and James Armistead became a free man. From that time onward, he called himself James Lafayette. By the year 1819, when he was growing old, James Lafayette had become poor and unable to help himself. Once more he turned for help to the Assembly, which voted him $60, a large sum for those days. He was also granted $40 a year for the rest of his life, a pension such as those paid to privates who had served in the army during the Revolution. One of the great days in James Lafayette's life came in 1824, when he was 64 years old, and the aging Lafayette visited Richmond on his final tour of America. Great crowds lined the streets to see the French hero who had made possible American independence, and thousands watched as the Marquis greeted James Lafayette as an old comrade, which means a friend, an old friend, but a comrade's more like a military friend. Here's another picture of James. It was during this visit to Richmond that James Lafayette sat for his portrait, painted by the well-known artist John B. Martin. The portrait still hangs in a Virginia museum, showing the lean, erect black spy dressed in a handsome military coat, as a reminder of the days when he had won his own freedom and helped to win that of his country as well. It is thought that the friendship and faithful service of James Armistead Lafayette caused the Marquis to become a leader in the movement to end slavery and to extend help to the black people of many nations. At the close of the Revolution, Lafayette suggested to Washington a plan which might greatly benefit the black part of mankind. He suggested that they purchase a small estate where we may try the experiment to give the Negroes use of them only as tenants. This, and don't be mad at me for saying the word that's in there, this led Lafayette to other efforts to outlaw slavery. In Paris, 5 years later, he helped to found a society of the Friends of the Blacks, and for the rest of his life he supported efforts to give equal rights to men of all races. James Armistead Lafayette was the best-known black spy in the American Army, but he was by no means the only one. A slave by the name, and I have to stop on this page because I'm out of time. It'll have to be a third video. See you in a few, guys.